Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Friday Ramblings. This is our 4th of July special. A couple days early, but that's alright. Nothing wrong with being a little early to start the party, because we are counting down to 4th of July. It is the 4th of July weekend. Happy birthday to America! And that's why we're going to do something a little bit special. And that is something long awaited for me personally as your host of the Ramblings. We are going to discuss once and for all, now and forever. Look at me all. Barely there with the hair. Up high. Pew. And that is, we're going to discuss the classic Marvel Comics run of G.I.Joe Real American Hero. Because after all, 4th of July, America's birthday, a real American hero. Together. But the other reason why is that by the end of the year, actually probably shortly before the end of the year, we will see the cancellation of the second volume of G.I. Joe Real American Hero. I'm going to go ahead and touch on that basis real quick before we get into the nitty-gritty of things. We're going to have a little bit of context laying down. So, here we go. While G.I. Joe Real American Hero by Marvel Comics was not the first comic book to be based off the G.I. Joe toy line, G.I. Joe toy line itself actually being a series of varying toy lines, this comic book is the most well known as it did help drive the sales of the G.I. Joe Real American Hero line, which is the G.I. Joe that 90% of pop culture is aware of. Previous versions of the G.I. Joe toys were limited to one or a handful of characters who appeared, basically variants of one male soldier who was literally codenamed G.I. Joe. You would occasionally get a couple allies of his, including the Nurse Jane, representing the many fine medical-based representatives of the women in the military from previous decades. Always good to know. Always good to notice. But as I said, the Real American Hero line is where everything is all said and done, but I do want you to keep in mind those technically previous iterations of G.I. Joe because they're not 100% dead. Woohoo! Now, as we said before, G.I. Joe Real American Hero was made by Marvel Comics in association with Hasbro. Blah, blah, blah. Hasbro was getting ready to launch the new toy line and went to Marvel Comics not only to make a promotional tie-in comic, but through the highly fertile mind of already experienced comic book writer Larry Hama, the comic and Mr. Hama helped flesh out the personalities of the characters, some of them actually debuting in the comics before they were even given toys, and Hama himself writing the vast majority of the old school toy figures bios that would feature on the back of the package. I mean, I want to say he did all of them, but if I say that and go on record saying all of them, something's going to come up where somebody's going to be like, well, you know, this one figure was actually written by somebody else. So we're just going to go with the vast majority. Nearly all of them, potentially all of them. All with a little asterisk. So that's the most important thing to know, is that this wasn't just a tie-in comic. In many ways, it was the backbone of the entire Real American Hero franchise. Yes, there was the toy series, but as I said, writer Hama had input on the toy series and the characters that were made as much as he could. And while he did not have any direct influence on the cartoon, the simple fact of the matter is that the cartoon also saw influence from the comics and vice versa, since many characters appeared in the comics before their cartoon counterparts. We will no doubt have a discussion of the classic Real American Hero cartoon on a future episode. But we are going to focus on the Marvel comic. Now, it should be noted that Larry Hama himself had been a military man previous to writing G.I. Joe. He had served in Vietnam as a weapons and explosive ordnance expert. This also allowed him to serve as editor of Marvel's other war comic, The Nam, which was a very realistic depiction of the Vietnam War and the soldiers that went through it. That editorial job, which came previous to G.I. Joe, was one of the things that really kept him heavily employed at Marvel, besides his great writing ability, which includes stints on many classic superhero-style comics. But we are here to talk about G.I. Joe. Again, we're laying out a bit of context. The original G.I. Joe comic ran for 155 issues. Now note, this is standard issues. This does not count things like annuals, specials, the G.I. Joe Transformers crossover miniseries, or the spin-off books. See, when you have something that runs for 155 issues, which is approximately 12 years, you're of course going to have spin-off material. In this case, you had G.I. Joe Order of Battle, a 4-issue miniseries that was essentially a collection of the different bios as both G.I. Joe and Cobra, as well as weapon specs on their vehicles. You also had the other series. I want to make sure I'm quoting this right. So many notes. Where was my note? Where I had this? It was I want to say it was G.I. Joe Special Missions, if I'm remembering right. Sorry, my notes ran away from me. But there was a spin-off series that ran for 28 issues that, being a spin-off book and a little more under the radar of Marvel editorial and their desire to have, while a somewhat realistic depiction of war, still don't want to make it too shopping itself out of the market for children to read. The spin-off book was allowed to be a little more graphic in its violence. This, of course, as I said, it didn't last quite as long, but it did feature some great storylines to it. So when it's all said and done, what's so great about the comic? Well, simple as I said, that it did show a somewhat realistic portrayal of what the soldiering life is. Whereas in the cartoon, the characters had futuristic sci-fi laser weaponry. The comic book, they used real military armaments. In fact, Hama, using his knowledge and experience of the real-world military, would actually have the soldiers use real-world military slang, to the point of, amusingly, occasionally, editors having to put in little footnotes of, you're not getting the complete context of this, you may have to ask your family members that have served in the military what this term means. Because that's just the way it is with military jargon. Some of it you gotta get explained to you, or be there in the moment at the time. But it wasn't just a matter of, hey, it's real guns firing real bullets. One of the advantages that Hama was able to massage into the comic book, in the sense of making these characters very real to readers, is that since the comic ultimately at the end of the day was designed to promote a toy line, and new toys would be released, and Hasbro would want emphasis on those new toys and new characters, This would result in Hama being given permission by the Hasbro editors as well as the Marvel editors to kill characters off that were not going to factor into plans for future toy lines. Most stories he would do this, 1 or 2 characters at a time. These were oftentimes, as I said, some of the most real emotional stories. There's a very great one where you see 2 Joes get injured while far behind enemy lines. One of them very critically injured. So his partner pulls up the old fireman's carry and spends basically half a day carrying him back to base. Upon arriving at base, where the other squadron members begin flanking them and checking on their friends that they hadn't even been able to confirm were alive to this point, the on-site medic points out that the gentleman being carried had in fact died 4 hours ago. Dusty's only response to why he burdened himself carrying the body of a fallen soldier for 4 hours is, "I promise to bring him home." Because for soldiers, you guys know what that means. Yeah. The I.Joe movie and the cartoon had a line from Sergeant Slaughter where he quotes, "We all go home or nobody goes home." And in the movie, everybody survives to go home, although there's a close call with a couple members. But for those who served or those who read the comics, they knew, well, that phrase doesn't always have the happiest ending, even though it is still taken quite seriously. Everybody comes home or nobody comes home, because that's the soldiering life. Perhaps the most infamous example, though, of this cleaning the slate for characters to be introduced was a storyline in which a full squadron of G.I. Joes were captured by Cobra, and when the Cobra commander radios what to do with the Joes, his somewhat vague orders, which were further considered interpretable over a bit of a garbled radio, that Cobra considered this a hassle and a problem and deal with it right away, resulted in one Viper, as many of the Cobra troops were called, of a specific rank, taking it upon himself to do something truly immoral and sadistic, gunning down several G.I. Joes while they were tied up, weaponless, and helpless. A few of the Joes survived this massacre and joined up with the rest of their unit to hunt this one down, who himself was disavowed by Cobra Commander because, as he pointed out, "You idiot, now you've got every G.I. Joe hunting for your head. This is exactly the kind of trouble I didn't want. You don't slaughter prisoners like that." And again, if you don't think that's realistic, go talk to some military historians. There's a lot of wars through a lot of centuries that did not run well because one side decided not to respect the concept of honorable fighting. Remember, the UN's got this whole list of rules of warfare in modern times, and a lot of it deals with how you treat prisoners of war. You know? Don't shoot helpless people just because it's too much of a hassle to carry them to your headquarters. No. It's very bad. But lovely host, what? This is supposed to be entertaining children's books. Yeah, technically it was, but again, you've got a Vietnam vet wanting to write something that would be really dramatic, entertaining reading, while at the same time paying respect to what soldiers go through in combat. And he struck that balance well. Don't get me wrong, we've talked about some very serious, even dark stuff, but when push comes to shove, Hama knew when to sit back and have some laughs. There were many things in the G.I. Joe comic that were there for humor. Characters would good-naturedly snark at each other, while patrol duty was being a bit light and boring. Cobra Commander himself was known at times to go on rambling rants and basically just say stuff because his own ego couldn't fathom the fact he had been losing this badly. I mean, there was humor of various kinds to be found in the book. At the end of the day, one of Larry Hama's great strengths as a writer was he knew when to sit there and put a brakes on the intensity and say, okay, let's be a little lighthearted for a while. So why did the book end? Well, as I said, it was a tie-in for toys and a cartoon series. Except the cartoon series bottomed out 3 years before. The toy line was down to its last gasping legs. Basically, G.I. Joe was a fad that had hit its point of, we don't care anymore, we're ready for the next thing. Hama himself would refer to it as the book's half-life. For those of you who are unscientifically minded, half-life refers to the phenomenon in which a given element is a measurement of how long half of that element's mass takes to decay in a natural setting. Thus, half-life is occasionally used in slang terminology as a term for natural expected decay. The book couldn't last forever. The fact that Hama wrote all but a handful of those 155 issues speaks to his strength as a writer. And honestly, even those last issues, while they were not as good as what had been done in previous years, again, mostly because of Hasbro insisting that Hama introduced not just new characters, but updated, affiliations and spin-off teams for old characters. The fact he had to spend like 4 or 5 issues with the whole Eco Warriors line because it was the early 90s. We had Captain Planet and, the whole eco movement that was being pushed really hard on children across the culture. Yeah, G.I. Joe had a handful of soldiers whose goal was to go out and punish polluters. And they had a Cobra villain who was, I think the guy's name actually was Cesspool. He was like a CEO of a industrial chemical company and like spray chemicals on you and dissolve your tank. It's not the stuff that Hama was thrilled about to write. Not to mention the poor artist, which did vary. Herb Trimp, who was an incredible artist, did several books on Marvel, did a lot of the art for G.I. Joe, especially the early years, but the last couple years, again, a lot of old characters got refreshed uniforms to keep them in the new toy waves, and those uniforms did not look good in comic book context. I mean, and they were so sudden. Like, it was pushed on the artist. You could tell both Hama and his art team. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't have the notes for the individual artists for individual issues, because we are just doing a sweeping, generalized review here. But you could tell they really weren't all that thrilled about the looks of some of these uniform changes either, because they're just, the characters are just one issue, they're in new uniforms and there's no explanation for it. It's just one of those things of, look, it's got to happen. Let's just try not to focus too much on this part of it. But still, many things were done in the G.I. Joe comic, spanning the long history of it. And the fact that it ran 12 years, and in fact for a couple years was one of the most highly subscribed to books being printed by Marvel Comics. I mean, that's just mind-blowing. You know, merchandise books like this were expected to last 2-3 years. I mean, even going with 3 years, Hama quadrupled that expectation. He did 4 3-year stints, and 3 years was the optimist version. If you want to go with the realistic version of, man, we might get 2 years out of it, he did that 6 times over. And again, that's not counting the 28 issues of the spin-off book. Or the Transformers crossover they did to introduce the Transformers Generation 2 stuff. Actually, no, there were 2 crossovers. Excuse me. Because Transformers Generation 2 comic and related toy line was done in a standard storyline in the book. No, it was but earlier, when they were getting it set to introduce some of the new character redesigns for the Transformers toy line, like Goldbug and some of Megatron's alternate forms instead of just the big pistol, you know. And I think some new characters. I'm sorry, I haven't read the particular story arc in like 6 years. I don't remember all the intimate details of it, but they did a mini-series because there was a Transformers ongoing book done by Marvel. So they were like, well, we got to introduce a bunch of changes real quick, and we'll just kind of mash this stuff together. Introduce some changes for Transformers. Didn't do a lot for G.I. Joe continuity change, but if you do want to read a thorough reading of the entire Marvel G.I. Joe run, go seek out that original crossover. But that's what I'm saying. Like, the Transformers comic book had been canceled a few years before. They were going to introduce the Gen 2 book. They were like, well, we got to do something to promote it. We'll take over G.I. Joe for a couple issues. That was some of the stuff that he got saddled with in the later years. Still, it was all in great fun. One of my favorite things about it, because it does tie into stuff we've talked about before in previous video, there was a G.I. Joe toy that was christened Ghost Rider because he was a pilot of one of their stealth jets. And of course, this also tying in reference to the song Ghost Rider in the Sky. But because Marvel already had a character they created for their own superhero supernatural needs named Ghost Rider, who in fact was currently being published, there was some stickiness involved in using Ghost Rider. So Larry Hama found an elegant solution wherein the character only appeared intermittently in the books, and whenever he did, the running gag is that nobody could remember his code name. It's like, oh man, that was that pilot. He flies this you know, the A6-7XR, you know, bit. It's like, oh yeah, that guy. Yeah, it's him. He's a great pilot. Y'all remember what his name was? No, it always slips my mind. The point that after a couple appearances, the pilot himself was joking about it. They'd be on the radio, and someone's like, "Oh, the mission's done. You come back to base, guy." And it's all right. I know everybody forgets my name. I don't care anymore. I mean, it was a running joke because they couldn't use the name that Hasbro insisted the character have, because Marvel already had that name for another character. Now, I said that's some of the incidental humor that Hama was brilliant at sneaking in. And we even had a little bit of romance. Most infamously is the long-standing romance between Scarlet and Snake Eyes. They actually were very involved with each other when the book began and stayed together the entire run of the series, although because occasionally they would not be on the same squad and working together, it wasn't something where every issue was shoved in your face. But at the end of the day, their relationship was one of the backbones of the I.Joe teamwork. That actually leads to one of the most famous issues of I.Joe, the silent issue. Basically a challenge created by the creative team. Hama wanted to tell a comic book story with no dialogue, basically as a way of showing just how strong the artists were on the book, and how with no dialogue or narrate, I don't even think narration boxes. There might have been a couple right at the start of the issue to, set up some of the context. But, I mean, they didn't lean heavily on them as a substitute. And again, I'm not even 100% sure there was, as I said, there might have been one or two, like one right at the end, beginning, one right at the end. But 90% of the book, there was nothing. There was no words. It was the artists being given full chance to step up and shine, and they did it beautifully. The idea of the story being that Snake Eyes raided Destro's fortress castle to rescue Scarlet, who had been taken prisoner. Perfect context for a silent issue. Stealth, infiltration, and escape. Now, granted, there was gunfiring and stuff, but, sound would have occurred inside their world. But there was no dialogue between the characters. Snake Eyes, who was a mute character to begin with, he didn't taunt the bad guys, and that was the beauty of it. This issue was done so well after they established Snake Eyes that we knew he was a mute. We didn't expect him to talk in the issue, and Scarlet didn't need to say anything to Snake Eyes because they were so emotionally close. She expected him to be the one to come save him, and she knew what he needed out of her during the mission. They were simpatico. My brain to your brain. Perfect setup for this issue that, again, nobody thought was weird and out of place because all those pieces had been set up previously. We knew Snake Eyes and Scarlet were in love with each other, that they had been for a while. We knew Snake Eyes was a mute ninja. Everything just clicked together to the point that that was not only considered one of the best issues of comic books released that year, but many years later is still touted as one of the best experiments in comic book storytelling from the major companies. Hell, years later, Marvel did a whole month of silent issues across various books they had at the time called Nuff Said Month. I mean, that's how infamous that book was. So, and I mean, that's what I gotta tell you. If you've never read the Marvel run of G.I. Joe, you need to read it. I'm not going to tell you to go ahead and invest in the entire run, because again, 155 plus 28, that is 183 issues if you read the spin-off book, which I do recommend because there was some back and forth continuity. That's a lot to ask people to do, but I will say read the first 12 issues. Read the first year of the book at least. There's some great storylines, wonderful character debuts and adventures in that first year. Check it out. So as I said before, what does this have to do with recent news and the Volume 2? Well, years after the Marvel series ended and their various licensing deals with Hasbro expired, publisher IDW, old buddies of ours, you will recall them from our discussions of various Ghostbusters media, as well as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, got the license to produce G.I. Joe books. Now, they did produce books set in new continuities with fresh starts for new readers, done by a variety of writers. However, at the same time, they would also publish a long-running comic continuing the Marvel continuity, thus A Real American Hero Volume 2. But here's the fun part. They kept the legacy numbering. Instead of starting over with a new issue 1, they did a 155 and a half to basically catch up new readers on what had happened in the classic Marvel run, as well as set up a couple plot points for the new series, and then went into issue 156. The series is set to end with issue 300, which means Volume 2 is ran damn near as long as the original. So how did they do that? How did they keep that flavor and vibe all the same? Simple. They got Larry Hama to come back and write it. Again, there may have been one or two annuals and whatnot done by fill-in writers, but the entire thing has been a love letter by Larry Hama. Now, Volume 2, even though it is supposed to be in the same continuity and only occur a couple years after issue 155, which ended the Volume 1 run at Marvel, it is like that book was set in present time. So it's one of those things where if you read Volume 1 and then jump right into Volume 2, there's some discrepancy in technology and cultural perceptions, because both books were written intended to be in present time, even though they were written decades apart. So it's as I said, it's a little strange if you read Volume 1 and jump right into Volume 2. There's going to be a couple mental moments where you're like, wait, why does this world suddenly have this technology? Just have to accept it. It's a sliding time scale issue thing. It happens a lot in fictional comic books. But I will say, as somebody that has been following this book as it's come out and has read every issue of Volume 2 so far, it is very good as well, and maintains a lot of that same, this stuff is real, there are consequences for behaviors, there are deaths of characters on both sides going on that made Volume 1 iconic. Check it out. So, are we going to talk more about G.I. Joe in the future? Sure. I may go back in my archives, read up on select issues. I may discuss individual characters, how their portrayals in the comics differed from the cartoon that most people know and love, modern movies and whatnot. I don't know. There's a pretty deep G.I. Joe well. Not to mention comic books that were written by people like Devil's Due, in between the end of the Marvel run and IDW restarting the Real American Hero timeline. There's the whole thing about the various toy lines, some of the later cartoons as part of the short run toy lines. There's just, as I said, it's a very deep well. So, I don't know how deep it'll go when it's all said and done, but I do know this. In a couple days, it's going to be America's birthday. Larry Hama has led a very interesting life, much of which could only occur here in America. The man has been an actor, writer, editor, soldier, very multi-talented, multifaceted individual. And, lovingly and most importantly, he is a proud American. So we do say, while people may have some issues with some things going on in the country, even some things done by our government, hey, when the 4th of July comes around, just like we do on Roulette Productions with all our videos, focus on the good parts. Focus on the silver lining just for a day. Because it's a birthday celebration, and we all want to enjoy ourselves. Go read some G.I. Joe comics. Feel that love. Feel that patriotism. Because you can't be a real American hero without America. God bless. Come back in 7. Because we're going to keep rambling. We got a whole July full of stuff to chit-chat about. Bye-bye, folks.